Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in the Fieldfisher Silicon Valley third-party vendor management series. If you joined us for part one, you'll know that we covered the what and why of conducting vendor privacy assessments, particularly covering where an organization's obligations to conduct these sorts of risk assessments on vendors comes from. Today in part two, we're going to be looking at some of the common risks, delving a little bit deeper into where they come from and how to manage them. I'm Megan Ward. I'm a privacy advisor in the Fieldfisher Silicon Valley office. And to tackle this topic today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Mark Webber, who's the US managing partner of the Fieldfisher SBO, and Paul Lamois, who's a director in our team. So I think the most logical place to start is taking a couple of steps back and thinking about what is risk and where does it originate.
Thank you, Megan. And obviously this is part of a three-part mini-series, our session here. And the last session, our colleagues spent quite a lot of time looking at third-party risk management and how you manage those third parties, but they were very focused on what the law said you should do. So talking about DPAs, data processing agreements, and that the controller must be responsible for its processes and that it must flow down certain terms and perform due diligence and to comply with Article 28. Then they went on to talk about international data transfers and the need to do a transfer impact assessment and what factors might be considered in that impact assessment. Of course, absolutely fantastic law, and it's what drives a lot of what we do. But some of what drives what we do is actually just best practice. And I think one of the problems with GDPR and the where we've got to with the international transfer arrangements and the difficulties in moving data around the globe is sometimes as privacy professionals, we can spend way too much time focused on the prescribed process. And by focusing on that process, we're obsessed with, do we have a DPA? Is the SCCs? What modules have we put in place? Have we got that transfer impact assessment? All good stuff, but that can, when we're doing this at volume, and sometimes there's incredible volume that some teams are managing, we kind of lose sight of what we're trying to do and why. And in some ways, I just want to take a little step back there to look at sources of risk, because actually what we're looking to do is protect against harms and protect our data or our people or our operations against those harms. So we're actually talking about methods of dealing with risk and controlling risk, some of which, as our esteemed colleagues last time talked about, have been set out in law. Thou shalt do this and that, and your contract shall look like this, and at a minimum you have these provisions in place. But what those obligations are doing, they've really also looked at sources of risks and looked at the common problems around data and then tried to be prescriptive about what businesses should do. But they don't necessarily think about the actual risk or what is really happening. And Sergio, one of our colleagues, talked about proportionality and the need to assess the risk and categorize data. And what we're really doing there is really trying to protect against something, either an object, a human, maybe it's a bad actor, maybe it's a negligent internal actor, some kind of process failure, some kind of security breach, all things that, if they should happen, are capable of causing harm. And essentially, that's what we're really doing where we're dealing with third-party management. Yes, we're jumping through some of those hoops. Yes, there's a process, and we'll revisit that at the end of this session. But ultimately, we should actually be thinking about the sources of risk and prioritizing around some of that. So risk management starts with understanding the enterprise. Each enterprise and the way it conducts business is going to be heavily influenced by its environment, internal factors, external factors, and the context in which it operates. It may be a financial services business with financial services regulations or lots of money that people want to get at. It may be a pharmaceutical business doing testing with a number of compliance and a number of different processes around the globe that it has to follow in order to meet with some of some of those laws. Many businesses have data, and there are cyber risks. Of course, as privacy professionals, we can focus all the time on personal data, but actually all data is valuable. There's confidential data, there's intellectual property data, there's trade secret. Not all personal data is the only, well, sorry, I should say not personal data isn't the only source of risk if it's lost. So cyber attacks, getting at data, infiltrating, getting hold of data, but also cyber attacks which may simply disable a system. Just think of your own world. If you don't have Slack and you don't have email for a day, that could impact you. We saw some outages yesterday, lots of press, reputational damage. Some people couldn't listen to their streaming music. Other people were worried about their chat. But why was that? Was that a strategic kind of risk? Had it, what kind of impact did it have? It had operational impact, it had financial impact, presumably. But also may have strategic impact. It may have led others to think, oh, I can't sign up for this service, I'll move to another one. So lots and lots of different factors that we're talking about. And of course, with third parties, the topic of this entire session, we're really talking about external risks, but also internal risks in the way we use and deploy those third parties. So are we making the right assessment of the third party we're bringing on board? Do we miss compliance step? Do we expose ourselves to cyber risks because we haven't vetted, or there's no checking of the way our code is integrating with this third party? Is it a tool which will be sensibly used, or could it involve secret recordings or employee monitoring, or create other risks from a lack of sensible use? So sometimes the third party themselves can introduce new factors which might cause risk within the enterprise. And then there's also the concept of proper configuration. The majority of SaaS and online products that we see, there's a level of security responsibility that the third party takes on, but also a level to which the organization buying that third party takes on. Are they properly configuring it? Is there an option to encrypt or not encrypt? Is there an option to truncate third-party IP addresses and introduce some pseudonymization? Do I have to introduce multi-factor authentication, or have I got an option to encrypt at rest or not? Some of those are actually shared responsibilities. The vendor will do some things, make some tools available, but then it's up to us to enable those systems and configure them in a way that protects us. So lots to think about. And if we could maybe go to the next slide, Megan. What we're really doing is characterizing the risk and thinking through and evaluating intent and capability and threats, essentially looking at the relative value of the assets or resources that we're using within our enterprise, looking at trust that we can put in place, and then assessing the consequence of failure. What would happen if the worst thing happened? And then we're looking at the presence or extent of vulnerabilities. What can be exploited? Could we be, what can be interrupted? How could that be interrupted? What's the threat of modification? What's the threat of fabrication of data, of preventing access to data? Just beginning to look at all of those kind of consequences to characterize our risk. And it's important, because if we don't characterize that risk, we can't have a meaningful discussion within the enterprise. And a lot of the time, as we'll see as our colleague Paul starts to talk, as privacy professionals and those tasked with implementing good privacy, it takes a church, to use that phrase. We need to bring others with us. We need to bring on board our information security team. We need to bring on board the procurement team, perhaps, or the legal team that are, negotiating elements of the contract, or you're potentially looking at those users, looking at, okay, we're going to give you this tool, but how are you going to use the tool? Actually, the threat might not come from the third party. It might come from the way the third party is deployed, or not putting in guardrails in the way something is deployed. So we're constantly evaluating these concepts. And my main message is we can get lost in the tick box exercise of contracting and demonstrating and having all our accountability steps. But really the core accountability step, it comes from a level of categorization and risk assessment. So if we move to the next slide, there actually was some echo of this with Sergio and Andrea in our prior session. And Megan, if we can click on, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I talked about having a meaningful discussion. I really, that comes from a level of understanding of those risks and all speaking the same language. I think it was Flick, our colleague last session, talked about categorizing risk, essentially, or categorizing vendors, sorry. The reason they were looking at categorizing vendors was almost putting it into a high, medium, and low priority. Yeah, part of that, they were beginning to suggest that we needed to, maybe not treat all vendors the same or not treat all services the same, because simply, one, we might be overrun with resources, or two, it might be disproportionate, or three, it just might be commercially impossible to hammer a very small provider with 60 questions, lots of documentation, and lots of bespoke negotiation. So as a part of that, we need to be starting to quantify and understand our risks. As I said, so we can all talk about them, but identifying the nature of the risk involves working out what assets am I trying to protect, what resources, what people, what systems, what could go wrong, identifying the threat vectors, so what could go wrong to those assets, and you're beginning to think about, well, what could go wrong. If I know what could go wrong, I can start to think about consequence. So as part of consequence, I'm also thinking about, well, how likely is it that that happens, and assessing the odds that something will happen. In the early days of risk management, this was very much around probability. I think more and more risk management and technical enterprise risk management processes have gone into think about consequences, and in particular the impact on value. So we might see a risk, but that risk might be low probability, low consequence, and not something we focus on. We might see a higher risk, and I think we can always see, well, if we're going to put all our data into one provider as a host, the chances of that provider going down or having a security incident or losing our data, we're far more impacted than if we send 2,000 email addresses to a local Los Angeles-based marketing company to help us with a small event. We're basically, by identifying threats and identifying likelihood, getting into a discussion about probability and scale. If we've really thought about probability, likelihood, and scale, we can then start thinking about which risks we want to respond to the most. And this would be part and parcel of our third-party management process, because if we understand the risks, we can then start to triage and do some of the categorization our colleagues talked about in the last time. We might simply say, I'm going to accept that risk. It's not proportionate to hand this, or I'm going to act upon that risk. In fact, I see such a risk, I'm not even going to use this third party, or I'm going to do this a different way, or I'm going to take more time to engage. But what we're really beginning to do is manage and control risks with a level of understanding. And I think my main message here is, if we've lost sight of why we're doing something, why we're putting in a DPA, why we're doing the SCCs, in some circumstances, we're not going to get the contractual protections, we're not going to get the process and the guardrails, and there's more to life than putting in place a DPA and getting on with life. Yes, I know I'm layering on another obligation to teams, but sometimes, although the law says have a DPA, of course that DPA is important, but whether that DPA is perfect or just ticks the parts of the GDPR, sometimes from a privacy perspective, if you've identified the risks and looked to control those risks, it may be far better other things you do around that vendor or around that process to protect the data. It's nice to have a contract, you can flow down liability, you're required to do it, but what about if you thought about minimization? Let's not send all that data to that vendor. What about if you'd thought about deletion and retention, and only taken steps to put in guardrails to delete data every 30 days within the vendor so it doesn't pile up? Or what about if you delved into security and realized, well, it wasn't encrypted by default, but we have the ability to silo it and encrypt it. All of these other things aren't going to happen simply by signing off a DPA. There's more you need to do as you're evaluating third parties, and those controls are often more effective in protecting yourself, your data subjects, and your enterprise than simply putting in the contract. Of course, we might need a contract, or we might flow down liability at the end of the day, but actually operational changes and managing risk, having identified that risk, will help us in a much better way. So I'll leave you with that thought and turn to Megan just to pick us up and look at that vendor chain and global footprint issue.
Thanks, Mark. And I think that's a really helpful lens to kind of look through the common risks that Paul and I are going to talk about. So I'm going to start with the vendor chain and global footprints, and then Paul's going to go on to talk to you about some of the security risk with all of that backdrop. So the complexity of data processing chains makes it challenging to follow and assess those risks that we've just talked about. And as I think Flick mentioned last time, the average business is around 700 vendors. And so if each vendor in that chain also has a similar number, it makes for a tricky web to kind of pick through. And this is why mapping your data flows is key. It's particularly important when it comes to transfers, as you'll need this information to determine where you need to conduct your transfer impact assessments following Schrems 2 and the new SCCs. But it's also important from a general accountability perspective and a wider risk management perspective to know where your and your customers' data is going. So if we have a look at this diagram, if each of those vendors is in a different location and has a sub-processor in other locations, meaning they're onward transferring the data, it adds another dimension to kind of that web that we just talked about. As a quick recap, and as my colleagues covered in more detail in part 1, the GDPR requires that the protection afforded to the data in Europe should travel with the data wherever it goes. So looking at the diagram, if that European customer's data is transferred to a vendor in the US for processing, and then that data is onward transferred to, say, sub-processor 2 in India for support purposes, then the protection that's afforded to the data in Europe should follow. You need to be satisfied that the transferred data continues to have a level of protection essentially equivalent to that under the European data protection regime. And this is where transfer impact assessments come in. If European data is being exported outside of Europe to a non-adequate country, you must conduct a transfer impact assessment. And this involves assessing the laws of the third country to ensure an essentially equivalent level of protection. So the main thing you need to map is when EU data is transferred to a non-adequate country, as those are the laws and practices you'll need to factor into your transfer impact assessments. And this raises a couple of practical questions, which goes back to kind of how can we manage and practically assess those risks. So taking a step back, how do you find out this information in the first place? Do you already have enough information to assess risk, or do you need to ask questions of the vendor? And some of this depends on how much resource and time you can allocate to the assessment process. So you'll need to think about things like, what do you already know at a basic level? Do you know where the vendor is headquartered? More importantly, do you know where the data is hosted? You then need to think about what questions do you need to ask the vendor and how you're going to build this into your existing kind of vendor onboarding process. And that might be through your existing intake questionnaire. And then finally, what information is publicly available? And we touched upon this last time, but most of the bigger vendors have provided customer-facing information. And so kind of collating some of those links and looking at that information might be the kind of best starting point. So the second thing to think about, and it's quite helpful to look at this diagram in chatting about this, is how far along the chain do you go to assess risk? And does it differ depending on whether you're starting up here as the controller, or whether you're actually the processor who's processing data on behalf of that controller? Remember, ultimately, it's the controller who is responsible for the processing chain, but the processor here is responsible for for its sub-processors. So everyone in the chain kind of needs to think about the risk assessment. Ultimately, you have to stop somewhere, because otherwise it would be a never-ending task to kind of assess the entire chain. And so as a business, you need to decide where is a sensible kind of stop point, and whether you're going to kind of change that stop point depending on the processing role that the business is taking. So there are a couple of options for like a practical and scalable approach. One of those could be, if you're the controller, you could decide to stop at the first level, and also considering where the data is going to be hosted. If you're the processor, you're going to likely want to delve a little bit deeper into your sub-processors and their location of processing. So I know that this all sounds like a mammoth task. So how can we make this manageable and scalable? And covered a couple of those options already, but having some sort of workflow or triage process will help to focus your efforts, time, and resources on those vendors and transfers that present the highest risk. And as we mentioned in part 1, and Mark chatted about earlier, you may want to consider categorizing your vendors into low, medium, and high risk levels. And this sort of categorization can include a combination of factors, and one of which would be the country risk and location of processing, in addition to things like the data risk, the type of processing, and kind of the general kind of privacy compliance steps that the vendor has in place. Now, TIA and transfers talk can take up a whole webinar series in and of itself. So I think let's skip on to security risk, which Paul's going to be taking a look at.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in relation to security, I realize it's a very technical area, and which can be somewhat daunting, but it's still a very important risk area that needs to be addressed. And for example, in the recent PwC Global Digital Trust Insights report, they found that only 40% of survey respondents said that they thoroughly understand the risk of data breaches through third parties. And nearly a quarter of the survey respondents had little or no understanding at all of those risks. 56% of the respondents expected an increase in reportable incidents in 2022 from attacks on the software supply chain. And just to be clear as well, it's not just a theoretical risk factor. There have been actually quite a number of recent security incidents and data breaches, which are a result of the software supply chain. A common scenario would be, for example, the Exchange, the Microsoft Exchange email server being compromised, and then that is being used to then crawl up to the rest of the network, and then maybe they're not even interested in the company that they're attacking, but then because they know that this company is servicing other larger attractive companies, then they use it as a way to enter into those companies as well. Yeah, there have been quite a number of recent attacks in relation to this point. And even in so last year, for example, there was this executive order issued by President Biden, and that was one of the points that they wanted to address as well, the fact that there have been an increase of attacks in the software supply chain. So that's an important area. So I'm not going to go into the technical specifics because it's a bit beyond the scope of this webinar. But then from a privacy professional standpoint, what should you be looking for? And in contracts, for example, you often see SOC 2, you see ISO 27001, and maybe others. And you may be wondering, well, what are these, and what are the differences? Well, SOC 2 refers to a set of audit reports which are meant to evidence the level of conformity to a set defined criteria. And on the other hand, you have ISO 27001, which is a standard establishing requirements for an information security management system. So the first difference is that SOC 2 is more an audit report, whereas the ISO 27001 is more a security standard. But then don't let the name audit report fool you, because it does cover security, but then it does have a somewhat different scope. The geographical applicability as well is somewhat different in the sense that SOC 2 is something which is extremely common in the United States, much less outside of the US, whereas ISO 27001 is more an international framework that you see around the world. And the SOC 2 is attested by a licensed certified public accountant, a CPA, whereas ISO 27001 is certified by the ISO certification body. So you have those two frameworks, and again, SOC 2 refers more to a set of audit reports, whereas ISO 27001 is more a security standard. You have other ISO security standards as well. You have ISO 27018, which is in relation to controls and guidelines to protect personally identifiable information in the public cloud computing environment. You have a newer framework as well, ISO 27701, which supplements existing control frameworks. So it's an additional layer on top of ISO 27001. And this ISO 27701 adds some privacy related controls to the mix. It's still relatively new though. So I mentioned quite a number of different certifications, and so maybe wondering, well, what do we do? What do we, do we just pick one, and that's once we see that in a contract, we're all good to go? Well, not necessarily, because in many cases, certifications are known to actually relate to a function or to a specific location or office, and not necessarily to the entire organization or function that is handling the customer data. So, it's certainly good to have, to have a certification. The key takeaway isn't that you shouldn't have security certification. It's quite the opposite. It is good to have one, because it does demonstrate, level of commitment to security. But then what I'm trying to convey here today is the fact that it's good to have a security certification, but then you have to be careful as well, and you have to look and dig deeper, because in many cases as well, it could also be seen more like a marketing tool, whereby you would get certain family auditors, for example, to audit and to issue a certification in relation to a specific function, but then maybe it doesn't cover what the product or the service that you're getting, or maybe it only covers a limited subset and so forth. So it would be important, to get the security team, to actually, dig deeper and to check that everything is, as you are looking for. That's about all I wanted to say. I think, given the limited time. Back to you, Megan.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'm conscious that we're coming up to, well, we've just passed the half hour, so we've got one more slide to cover. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. This is as much as anything the wrap up, and it echoes back to a slide from our initial session from Sergio that really talked about vendor risk management lifecycle, and as a part of that, we were basically starting to say, okay, well, the first session was like why and what are the origins of some of this process. In this second session, we've tried to look a little bit about what kind of risks might present themselves for different uses and encourage people to spend some time on looking at those risks, maybe categorizing them, identifying them, and then acting upon them in a proportionate manner, whether it's through process, whether it's through contractual obligation. But this is really kind of going back to that vendor life cycle and the risk management elements within that life cycle, because it really is, somewhere along the line, you as a privacy professional will be coming into this life cycle. It may be you're in a small legal department and you're a part of a lot of it. It may be you're in a very large business and you're only paying a part of it. Being aware of this general life cycle and your role in it, and then at what elements of this cycle you can kind of influence and act. Vendor identification is very key. There's an element of privacy by design you can deliver by vendor identification, because if you choose the right vendor and they can deliver the kind of compliance and tools and models that you want, that's going to help you a lot. So actually, in the very early design of certain products or services or certain third-party reliance, actually part of that vendor identification is key from a privacy perspective. Then there's the whole evaluation process. Some of that evaluation process might simply be about pricing and suitability and fit, but there may also be evaluation around what level of security. Paul mentioned the SOC, the ISO, do I understand this? How is data protected, etc. And then really this is where I think the messages come home from this session. There's a level of risk assessment and then mitigation steps, assessing the risks and measures you've put in place in order to protect that. That's part of any good privacy impact assessment or transfer impact assessment. But once you've done that assessment, you can then think about the contracting process. And then, as Sergio was talking about in the last session, record keeping, auditing, monitoring, then offboarding the vendor. Simple things like, did I remember to get my data back from that vendor? Did I ask for them to delete it? Am I clear that after we parted ways, we're in a good place with this vendor? Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to governance, and you should really be asking, as a privacy professional, are we doing the right things to prevent and isolate the risks in a privacy sense? Admitting you may have to work alongside other risk assessments for other parts of the business. Are we doing things in the right way? Is this life cycle correct? Are we asking questions? Are we asking the right questions? Do we have to go back and ask questions again because we're asking the wrong questions? Are we getting this done well? Is it something that's effective? We've alluded a number of times to how time consuming this is, and how, because it's process driven and how so much volume is there, we can almost lose sight of what we're really trying to achieve. Sometimes a simple mitigation step or technical step could be far more protective than the contract, but sometimes we're all guilty of looking to the contract to do so much. And then, are we really seeing the expected benefits of this, kind of that rinse, repeat, that ongoing accountability? Is this vendor evaluation and lifecycle something which is helping us as a business? And of course, this is going to be different for every business. There's going to be levels of maturity, but these are exactly the kind of issues we need to be thinking about as we continue to look at the vendor management and where we're coming from. So I'll hand back to Megan for a wrap up and a reminder of where we're going next. So
that was part 2. Part 3 is coming up on the 6th of April at 9 AM, same time, Pacific time. And in that session, my colleagues are going to look at negotiating DPAs and liability considerations. Thanks very much for joining, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.